In the late 1980s, the United States was no stranger to secrecy. Classified military projects were common, especially in the Nevada desert, where large portions of land were restricted and unmarked on public maps. Most people accepted this without question. What happened inside those areas was assumed to be related to advanced aircraft testing or weapons development. In 1989, this understanding was challenged by a man who claimed he had worked inside that system. Bob Lazar appeared in a television interview in Las Vegas and stated that he had been employed by the U.S. government at a highly classified site near Area 51. At first, he did not use his real name. He identified himself only as Dennis. According to him, this was done for personal safety, as he believed speaking publicly could put him at risk. Lazar's claim was specific. He said his work was not located at the main Area 51 facility, but at a separate site referred to as S4. This facility, he explained, was located south of Area 51, built into the side of a mountain. He stated that the purpose of S4 was not aircraft testing in the conventional sense, but the study of technology that did not originate on Earth. At the time, Area 51 itself was not officially acknowledged by the U.S. government. Its existence was widely rumored, but rarely discussed in formal terms. This made Lazar's claims unusual, not only because of their content, but because of their timing. Lazar stated that he was hired to work as a physicist. His assignment, according to him, was to assist in understanding the propulsion system of a recovered craft. He did not claim to have designed the technology or fully understood it. He described his role as limited and compartmentalized, with access only to specific parts of the project. From the beginning, Lazar's statements avoided emotional language. He did not describe fear or excitement. Instead, he focused on procedure. He described security briefings, background checks, and restricted access protocols. He stated that his work area was isolated and that communication between departments was intentionally limited. He explained that the facility operated on a need-to-know basis. Individuals were brought in only to solve narrow technical problems. They were not encouraged to ask questions beyond their assigned tasks. According to Lazar, this structure was designed to prevent any single person from understanding the full scope of the project. As his interviews continued, Lazar revealed more details. He described arriving at the test site on a specific flight path that avoided populated areas. He mentioned unmarked buses and security checkpoints. He stated that personal belongings were restricted and that monitoring was constant. What separated Lazar's account from earlier rumors was the level of detail. He did not claim to have inside knowledge of government strategy or alien intent. He focused on location, layout, and process. He described what he saw and what he was told, without attempting to explain why the project existed. Shortly after his initial interview, Lazar revealed his real name. With that disclosure came immediate scrutiny. Journalists began investigating his background. Questions were raised about his education, employment history, and credentials. Some of his claims appeared difficult to verify. Despite this, Lazar did not withdraw his statements. He repeated them in later interviews, maintaining the same descriptions and timelines. He stated that he came forward because he believed the technology he had seen was being mishandled and that secrecy had gone beyond reasonable limits. At this early stage, no evidence was presented that could confirm or disprove his story. There were no documents released, no photographs, and no official acknowledgement. What existed was a single source making a detailed claim about work conducted in one of the most secretive locations in the United States. This was how the Bob Lazar story began. Not with proof, and not with confirmation, but with a controlled account from someone who stated that he had seen something the public was never meant to know. And as more attention focused on his claims, the question shifted from what he was saying to whether his past could support it. After the first interview aired, attention quickly shifted from what Bob Lazar was claiming to who he actually was. Viewers did not focus only on the idea of a secret facility or advanced technology. They wanted to know how someone like Lazar had gained access to such a place in the first place. At the time of his initial appearance, Lazar avoided using his real name. He identified himself as Dennis and appeared with his face partially obscured. He explained that this decision was not theatrical, but practical. According to him, he believed that revealing his identity too early could expose him to retaliation or surveillance. This choice raised immediate suspicion among skeptics, but it also matched how whistleblowers had historically behaved when dealing with classified subjects. Lazar stated that before going public, he had already experienced what he described as pressure from authorities. He claimed that his security clearance had been revoked abruptly and that he was warned about discussing his work. In later interviews, Lazar explained why he eventually chose to reveal his real name. He said anonymity was no longer useful once journalists began investigating the details of his story. At that point, hiding his identity only made verification more difficult. By coming forward fully, he believed the focus could move from speculation to examination. Once his real name became public, reporters began searching for records that could either support or contradict his background. Lazar had stated that he held advanced degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the California Institute of Technology. These claims were significant because they were presented as the reason. He had been recruited to work on advanced propulsion systems. When journalists contacted these institutions, they were told that no records existed of Bob Lazar attending or graduating from either school. This immediately became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Critics argued that without proof of education, his claims lacked credibility. Lazar responded to this criticism directly. He stated that his academic records had been deliberately erased. According to him, this was done to undermine his credibility after he left the program. He claimed that removing his educational background would make it easier to discredit his statements without addressing their content. Skeptics countered that erasing records from major universities would be nearly impossible. Universities maintain multiple layers of documentation, including class rosters, yearbooks, and peer records. The absence of any such material raised serious doubts. Despite this, the investigation into Lazar's past did not end with education alone. Reporters also examined his employment history. Lazar had stated that before working at S4, he had been employed at Los Alamos National Laboratory, a facility known for advanced scientific research. In this case, partial confirmation emerged. Lazar's name was found in a Los Alamos phone directory from the period he claimed to have worked there. Additionally, individuals who had worked at the laboratory confirmed that they knew Lazar and that he had been present at the facility. However, disagreement remained regarding his role. Some sources described him as a technician or contractor rather than a physicist. Lazar maintained that his position involved scientific work and that titles within classified programs were often intentionally vague. Throughout this period, Lazar continued to repeat his original claims without alteration. His descriptions of S4, the security procedures, and the nature of his assignment remained consistent. He did not expand the story to include new elements, nor did he attempt to answer questions beyond what he said he knew. What became clear was that the focus of the case had shifted. The discussion was no longer centered on whether secret facilities existed in Nevada. Instead, it was about whether Bob Lazar himself fit the profile of someone who could have worked on such a project. At this stage, there was still no official response from the government addressing his claims. No confirmation was offered, and no denial was issued. What existed instead was a growing divide between those who saw Lazar as a whistleblower and those who viewed him as unreliable. As scrutiny increased, Lazar's story moved into a new phase. The attention was no longer limited to what he claimed to have seen, but to whether his personal history could withstand the pressure placed upon it. As scrutiny around Bob Lazar's background increased, his account of where he worked became a central focus. Lazar repeatedly clarified that his assignment was not inside the main Area 51 complex, but at a separate facility that he referred to as S4. According to Lazar, S4 was located several miles south of Area 51, near the Papoose Lake area. He described it as a highly restricted site built directly into the side of a mountain. From the outside, he said, the facility was nearly invisible. The entrances were concealed to blend with the natural terrain, making the area appear empty to anyone unfamiliar with its purpose. Lazar explained that access to S4 was tightly controlled. Personnel were transported on unmarked flights from Las Vegas to a nearby airstrip. From there, they were taken by bus to the facility. He stated that the flight path avoided populated areas and followed a specific route that differed from standard military flights. Upon arrival, individuals were required to pass multiple security checkpoints. Lazar described biometric hand scanners and badge systems that restricted movement within the facility. He emphasized that access was compartmentalized. Workers were only allowed into sections directly related to their assigned tasks. Inside the facility, Lazar claimed that several hangar-like spaces were built into the mountainside. These spaces were not traditional aircraft hangars. According to him, they were designed to house objects that did not resemble conventional aircraft in size, shape, or construction. Lazar stated that he was brought into one specific area and told that his responsibility was limited to understanding the propulsion system of a single craft. He was not given access to the full facility and did not interact extensively with other teams. Communication between departments was intentionally restricted. He described the work environment as controlled and formal. Conversations were limited. Questions outside of assigned responsibilities were discouraged. He said that most instructions were delivered through briefings rather than open discussion. One of the most notable aspects of Lazar's account was his description of how the facility was organized. He stated that each project was isolated, both physically and administratively. Workers were discouraged from forming a complete picture of what was happening beyond their immediate task. This structure, according to Lazar, was designed to prevent information leakage. Even if one individual spoke publicly, they would only be able to describe a small portion of the overall program. At the time Lazar made these claims, S4 was not a term used in any public documentation. The government had not acknowledged the existence of such a facility. This made verification difficult and added to the controversy surrounding his statements. Critics argued that without independent confirmation, S4 could not be considered real. Supporters countered that the lack of confirmation was consistent with how classified facilities were handled. Lazar did not claim that he chose the location or that he had prior knowledge of it. He stated that he was taken there as part of his assignment and that he followed procedures without question. He emphasized that the secrecy was presented as standard operating protocol. He also noted that maps available to the public did not show S4. Restricted areas were often left blank or labeled generically. According to him, this absence was intentional. Throughout his interviews, Lazar maintained a consistent description of S4's layout and function. He did not change the location, size, or purpose of the facility in later retellings. The details remained the same even as criticism intensified. At this point in the story, the discussion had moved beyond Lazar's identity and education. Attention was now focused on the physical place he described. If S4 existed, then the possibility of work beyond conventional aerospace research could not be dismissed outright. However, without official acknowledgement or physical evidence, S4 remained a claim supported only by Lazar's testimony. And as debate over the facility continued, Lazar's account shifted toward what he said was actually stored inside those hidden hangars, bringing the focus away from where he worked and toward what he claimed he was brought there to study. As Bob Lazar continued describing the S4 facility, his account moved away from security procedures and focused on what was actually housed inside the mountain. According to him, the purpose of S4 was not testing experimental aircraft designed by the United States, but studying technology that did not originate from any known human program. Lazar stated that during his time at the facility, he was shown multiple craft stored in individual hangar spaces. He consistently described the number as 9. These objects, he claimed, were not identical. Some appeared damaged, incomplete, or non-functional. One, however, was described as intact and operational. He emphasized that these objects did not resemble conventional aircraft. There were no wings, tail sections, or visible propulsion systems. The exterior surfaces were smooth, metallic, and uninterrupted by seams or rivets. According to Lazar, the material did not appear to be assembled from parts, but rather manufactured as a single piece. When Lazar first encountered one of these craft, he said it was positioned inside a hangar with minimal external support. There were no visible cranes, scaffolding, or maintenance platforms. The craft appeared to rest on its own structure, without landing gear or supports that would normally be required for an aircraft of any size. He described the size of the craft as relatively small compared to large military aircraft, but larger than what would normally be considered a drone. The shape was often compared to a disc or oval, but Lazar avoided dramatic descriptions. He stated that the craft was symmetrical and compact, with no clear indication of forward or backward orientation. Inside the hangar, Lazar claimed that the lighting was subdued and controlled. Access to the craft was limited, and he was only allowed to observe specific sections. He stated that even within the hangar, movement was restricted. Personnel were instructed where to stand and what to examine. One of the most frequently discussed details in Lazar's account was the interior of the craft. He claimed that he was able to briefly observe the inside during a demonstration. According to him, the interior did not resemble any aircraft cockpit he had ever seen. There were no control panels filled with switches or gauges. The interior walls were curved and smooth. He described small seats positioned close to the floor, suggesting the occupants were not human in size. Lazar avoided speculation about who or what the craft was built for. He simply described what he saw. Lazar also stated that the craft did not contain wiring in the way human-built machines do. There were no exposed cables, no circuit boards, and no visible electronic components. Instead, he claimed that the craft appeared to be built as a unified system, where structure and function were integrated. According to Lazar, his task was not to understand the entire craft, but to focus on one specific component, the propulsion system. He stated that he was given access only to that section and that he was discouraged from exploring other areas. He explained that the government had been in possession of these craft for an extended period of time. The reason for bringing in outside specialists, according to Lazar, was that previous attempts to understand the technology had failed. The technology did not follow known principles of aeronautical engineering. Lazar stated that he was not told when or where the craft were recovered. He was only informed that they were not man-made. This information, he claimed, came from briefing documents provided before he began work. These documents were reviewed in a controlled environment and were not allowed to be removed. At this stage of his account, Lazar's story began to attract significant attention. The idea that multiple non-human craft were stored in a U.S. facility was far beyond previous public rumors. Critics argued that such a program would be impossible to conceal. Supporters pointed out that compartmentalization and secrecy had successfully hidden other major programs in the past. Despite the controversy, Lazar did not alter his description. He did not add new craft, change their number, or revise their appearance. His statements remained consistent across interviews conducted years apart. What stood out was that Lazar did not claim ownership of the discovery. He did not say the craft had been recovered during his lifetime. He framed his role as limited and technical. According to him, his job was to attempt to understand something that had already been present for years. As attention remained fixed on the craft themselves, the next question naturally followed. If these objects were not powered by engines or fuel, then how did they move? That question led directly to the most controversial part of Lazar's account, the propulsion system he claimed to have studied. According to Bob Lazar, the most unusual aspect of the craft was not its appearance, but the way it was designed to move. He stated that the propulsion system did not rely on thrust, combustion, or any form of conventional engine. There were no turbines, exhaust ports, or fuel tanks associated with propulsion. Lazar explained that his assignment was to study this system in isolation. He was not tasked with understanding navigation, communication, or structural design. His focus was limited to how the craft generated movement. He described the propulsion system as consisting of three primary components positioned on the underside of the craft. These components were arranged in a triangular pattern. Lazar referred to them as gravity amplifiers. According to him, their function was to manipulate gravitational fields rather than produce forward thrust. Lazar stated that the craft did not push itself through space. Instead, it altered the space around it. He explained that gravity was treated as a wave, not a force, and that the system could amplify and direct these waves. In his account, Lazar said that when the propulsion system was active, it created a distortion in space-time. This distortion allowed the craft to move by falling into a controlled gravitational gradient. He emphasized that this movement would not produce the effects associated with acceleration in human-built vehicles. He claimed that this explained why the craft could make sudden directional changes without visible inertia. There were no G-forces acting on occupants in the way human pilots would experience them. The craft did not accelerate in the traditional sense. Lazar also stated that the propulsion system produced no detectable heat signature. This was consistent with what he described as a lack of energy loss through exhaust or friction. According to him, this was another reason the craft did not conform to known physics. He explained that during his brief exposure to testing procedures, The craft was placed on a support platform rather than flown freely. Tests were conducted in controlled environments, and access to live demonstrations was limited. Lazar claimed that the propulsion system was powered by a small reactor located at the center of the craft. This reactor was not designed like a nuclear reactor. It was compact and self-contained. He stated that its purpose was to generate a stable energy field rather than electricity in the conventional sense. He was told that the reactor used an unknown fuel source. This fuel was later identified to him as element 115. At the time, this element did not exist in any public scientific record. Lazar described the reactor as producing antimatter in small quantities. This antimatter was immediately annihilated in a controlled reaction, releasing energy. According to him, this energy was then converted into gravitational effects. He acknowledged that much of this information was beyond his full understanding. He did not claim to have built or replicated the system. He stated that his role was limited to analysis and observation. Throughout his interviews, Lazar emphasized that the propulsion system did not behave like any experimental aircraft technology developed by humans. There were no analogs within classified programs he was aware of. The principles involved did not match advanced jet propulsion or rocket systems. Critics argued that the physics described by Lazar lacked experimental support. They pointed out that gravity manipulation on this scale was not supported by established scientific models. Lazar responded by stating that the technology was not human-developed and therefore should not be expected to align with current understanding. He also stated that attempts to reverse engineer the system had largely failed. According to him, this was why the program remained compartmentalized and secretive. Progress was slow, and breakthroughs were rare. Lazar did not claim that the United States understood how to reproduce the technology. He stated that researchers were studying it without success, attempting to identify fundamental principles rather than build working replicas. As his account of the propulsion system became public, it drew both interest and criticism. Supporters saw it as a plausible explanation for observed UFO behavior. Skeptics viewed it as speculative and unsupported. What remained consistent was Lazar's restraint. He did not claim certainty beyond what he said he observed or was told. He repeatedly stated that his exposure was limited and that much of the system remained unexplained even to those studying it. As the discussion moved forward, one aspect of his claim became central to both sides of the debate. The fuel source he described, element 115, was unknown at the time, but would later become a focal point for evaluating his credibility. And with that claim, Lazar's story entered a phase where future scientific developments would be measured against statements made decades earlier. As Bob Lazar continued explaining the propulsion system, one specific detail became central to his account. He stated that the reactor powering the craft relied on a substance identified to him as element 115. At the time he made this claim, the element was not part of the known periodic table. Lazar explained that element 115 was stored at the S4 facility in small quantities. He described it as a dense, stable material that did not decay or react in ways consistent with known radioactive elements. According to him, this stability was essential to its function within the propulsion system. He stated that the reactor used element 115 to generate energy through a controlled process. This process did not involve combustion or conventional nuclear fission. Instead, the element was used to produce antimatter in small, precise amounts. According to Lazar, when antimatter came into contact with matter inside the reactor, It produced a large amount of energy. This energy was then directed into the gravity amplification system. He emphasized that the energy was not used to create thrust, but to manipulate gravitational fields. At the time Lazar made these statements, antimatter was known to science, but producing and controlling it in usable quantities was far beyond practical application. Lazar acknowledged this gap. He stated that the technology involved was not developed by humans and that researchers at S4 were attempting to understand it without full success. One of the most debated aspects of Lazar's claim was his description of element 115 as stable. Known synthetic elements at the time were highly unstable and decayed rapidly. Lazar maintained that the element used at S4 was a stable isotope that had not been synthesized publicly. Critics pointed out that Lazar did not provide a sample or physical proof of element 115. Without such evidence, the claim remained unverified. Lazar responded by stating that all materials at the facility were strictly controlled and that removal was impossible. Years later, in 2003, scientists officially synthesized element 115, later named moscovium. This development did not confirm Lazar's claims directly, as the synthesized element was unstable. However, supporters argued that the prediction of the element's existence before its public discovery was notable. Lazar did not claim that the publicly synthesized version matched the one he described. He stated that the version used at S4 was a specific isotope that had not yet been produced by modern science. This distinction remained central to debates surrounding his credibility. Throughout this period, Lazar's description of element 115 remained consistent. He did not alter its role, properties, or function in later interviews. The same explanation was given in different settings. Over several decades, he also stated that researchers at S4 were unable to reproduce the element or its effects. This, according to him, was one of the primary obstacles to understanding the propulsion system. Without the fuel source, the technology could not be tested or replicated. Lazar emphasized that the lack of progress frustrated those working on the project. The technology appeared complete and functional, but the principles behind it could not be reverse-engineered using existing scientific frameworks. He stated that this limitation reinforced the secrecy of the program. Without results to present, the project remained hidden and tightly controlled. There was no incentive to share information beyond the facility. As discussion around element 115 grew, it became a focal point for both belief and skepticism. Supporters viewed it as a forward-looking detail that aligned with later scientific developments. Skeptics viewed it as a convenient claim that could not be tested. Lazar did not attempt to settle this debate. He maintained that his role was to report what he observed and what he was told. He did not claim authority beyond that. As attention moved forward, the question shifted from what powered the craft to how Lazar came to observe its behavior directly. He had stated that he witnessed test flights and demonstrations. Those claims introduced another layer of scrutiny, as they suggested that the technology was not only stored and studied, but actively tested. And with that, Lazar's account moved beyond theory and into direct observation, where witnesses and recorded events would play a role in how his story was evaluated. As Bob Lazar's account continued, he shifted from describing how the craft functioned to how it was tested. According to him, the technology stored at S4 was not kept inactive. Controlled demonstrations and test flights were conducted on a regular schedule. Lazar stated that these tests typically took place on Wednesday nights. He explained that this schedule was consistent during his time at the facility. The reason, according to him, was to reduce the likelihood of civilian observation, as commercial air traffic and public activity in the surrounding desert areas were lower during those hours. He described being informed in advance when a test was scheduled. Access during these periods was even more restricted than usual. Only essential personnel were allowed near the test area, and observation points were clearly designated. According to Lazar, the craft was moved from its hangar to a test area where it could be activated briefly. These demonstrations did not involve long-distance flights. Instead, they were short, controlled movements designed to test stability and function. Lazar claimed that during one such test, he was able to observe the craft in operation. He described the movement as smooth and silent. The craft did not lift off like a helicopter or accelerate like a jet. Instead, it appeared to rise and reposition itself without visible force. He emphasized that there was no sound associated with the movement. No engine noise, no vibration, and no exhaust. The absence of sound was consistent with his earlier description of the propulsion system. Lazar stated that the craft could change orientation while hovering. He described a specific mode of operation where the craft tilted forward, aligning its underside toward the direction of travel. According to him, this configuration was used when the craft moved at higher speeds. He explained that during demonstrations, the craft's surface appeared unaffected by environmental conditions. Dust and debris on the ground did not behave as they would around a conventional aircraft. There was no visible turbulence or downwash. Lazar also claimed that the craft could remain stable even when powered at low levels. This suggested to him that the propulsion system was not operating at the limits of its capability during testing. At this point, in his story, Lazar described taking a significant personal risk. He stated that he brought friends to the desert outside the restricted area to observe the test flights from a distance. He believed that showing others what he had seen would provide independent confirmation. According to Lazar, he chose observation points far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough to see the lights and movement of the craft. On multiple occasions, he and his friends observed unusual aerial activity consistent with the test schedule he described. Some of these observations were recorded on video. The footage was grainy and lacked detail, but it showed distant lights performing movements that did not resemble conventional aircraft. These recordings were later made public. Lazar acknowledged that the footage alone did not prove the existence of alien technology. He stated that the value of these recordings lay in their timing. The observations occurred on the same nights and at the same times he had described before going public. Critics argued that the lights could have been experimental aircraft or other classified tests unrelated to Lazar's claims. Lazar responded that the consistency of the schedule and behavior matched what he had been told inside the facility. He also stated that shortly after these observations, security at the test site increased. He claimed that his access was restricted further and that his involvement with the program was terminated soon after. According to Lazar, this was the moment when he realized he could no longer remain silent. He believed that continued secrecy served no practical purpose and that the technology was being withheld without accountability. At this stage, Lazar's account included not only descriptions of facilities and systems, but also actions he said he personally took. These actions increased scrutiny and placed his claims under greater examination. What followed was a period of heightened attention from both media and authorities. Lazar's statements were no longer hypothetical. They were connected to observable events, recordings, and witnesses. As his story moved forward, the focus began to shift again. The discussion was no longer limited to what Lazar claimed he saw or studied, but to the consequences of speaking publicly about a classified program. And with that shift, Lazar's account entered a phase where pressure, investigation, and response would become just as important as the claims themselves. After Bob Lazar went public with his claims, the attention surrounding him increased rapidly. What had started as a local interview soon expanded into national discussion. With that attention came scrutiny, not only from journalists and skeptics, but also from authorities. Lazar stated that after his involvement with the S-4 facility ended, his security clearance was revoked without formal explanation. He described this as an abrupt change. One day he was part of a classified program, and shortly after, he was no longer permitted access to the site or its operations. According to Lazar, this revocation was followed by what he perceived as pressure. He claimed that his movements were monitored and that his communications were limited. He did not describe dramatic confrontations or arrests. Instead, he described a consistent presence that made it clear he was being watched. Lazar stated that this environment influenced his decision to speak publicly. He believed that remaining silent offered no protection. By going public, he felt there would be a record of his claims that could not be erased quietly. During this period, Lazar's name became widely associated with Area 51. Media coverage often focused on the secrecy of the base rather than the details of his technical claims. This framing contributed to both interest and skepticism. As journalists continued investigating his background, Lazar faced repeated questioning about his education and credentials. He responded consistently, maintaining that his academic records had been removed intentionally. He did not provide documentation, stating that none remained in his possession. This lack of records became a central point of criticism. Skeptics argued that without proof of education, his technical explanations lacked foundation. Lazar responded by pointing to his work history and technical understanding as evidence of his competence. At the same time, partial confirmation of his employment at Los Alamos National Laboratory continued to surface. Phone directories and personal accounts confirmed that Lazar had worked there during the period he claimed. The dispute remained focused on his job title and responsibilities. Lazar did not attempt to elevate his role beyond what he had stated earlier. He continued to describe himself as someone brought in to analyze a specific problem rather than lead a project. This consistency was noted by both supporters and critics. As public interest grew, Lazar also became the subject of official investigations unrelated to his claims. In later years, his business was raided by federal authorities. Lazar stated that these actions were connected to his past whistleblowing. Authorities maintained that the investigations were unrelated and based on separate concerns. These events reinforced the polarized perception of his case. Supporters viewed the investigations as continued pressure. Skeptics viewed them as unrelated legal matters. Throughout this period, Lazar's core story did not change. He did not introduce new details about the craft or the facility. He did not expand his claims to include additional locations or technologies. His account remained focused on the same elements he described in 1989. He also avoided presenting himself as a spokesperson for disclosure movements. He did not organize campaigns or call for public action. His involvement remained limited to interviews and responses to questions. As years passed, Lazar reduced his public appearances. He stated that the attention had become disruptive and that revisiting the subject repeatedly served little purpose. Despite this, his earlier statements continued to circulate. By this stage, Lazar's story had moved beyond technical claims and into a broader discussion about secrecy, credibility, and accountability. The question was no longer limited to whether alien technology existed, but whether the systems designed to protect secrets could also erase personal history. And as that question lingered, the debate surrounding Bob Lazar shifted again. It became less about immediate evidence and more about consistency over time. How a story holds up when repeated years later under the same scrutiny. That shift would define how his claims were viewed in the decades that followed. As the years passed, attention slowly shifted away from the immediate controversy and toward the consistency of Bob Lazar's account. While many public stories fade or change over time, Lazar's narrative remained largely the same each time it was revisited. Journalists who interviewed him years apart noted that the details of his story did not evolve. The description of the S-4 facility, the number of craft, the layout of the hangars, and the focus on propulsion systems stayed consistent. He did not add new discoveries or expand the scope of his claims beyond what he had originally stated. This consistency became a central point for those evaluating his credibility. Supporters argued that maintaining the same account over decades suggested authenticity. Skeptics countered that repetition alone did not equal truth, and that a well-rehearsed story could remain unchanged without being accurate. During this period, Lazar largely withdrew from public attention. He did not actively seek media coverage. Interviews became less frequent and were often conducted only when new developments related to UFO research brought his name back into discussion. When Lazar did speak, his tone remained measured. He avoided sensational language and did not attempt to frame his experience as proof of extraterrestrial contact. Instead, he continued to emphasize that his role was limited and that much of what he described came from briefings rather than first-hand discovery. One area that continued to attract discussion was the prediction of element 115. As scientific research progressed, and the element was officially synthesized, commentators revisited Lazar's early mention of it. Supporters highlighted that he had named the element years before it appeared on the periodic table. Skeptics pointed out that theorized elements beyond known atomic numbers had existed in scientific speculation long before Lazar's claims. They argued that predicting a future element did not validate the specific properties Lazar described. Lazar acknowledged these debates without altering his position. He stated that the element 115 synthesized publicly was not the same isotope he had been shown. He did not claim scientific validation, only that the element itself existed. Another aspect that remained under examination was the lack of physical evidence. No materials, photographs, or technical documents were ever produced by Lazar. He consistently stated that access restrictions made this impossible and that attempting to remove evidence would have resulted in severe consequences. Critics argued that without physical proof, the story could not be confirmed. Supporters responded that many classified programs leave no accessible evidence once access is revoked. During this time, broader public interest in UFOs began to change. Government agencies slowly acknowledged unidentified aerial phenomena, and discussions about advanced technology became more mainstream. This shift caused some to reassess older cases, including Lazar's. However, no official statements were issued that addressed his claims directly. There was no confirmation that S-4 existed as described, and no denial that addressed the specifics of his account. Lazar did not attempt to insert himself into these developments. He did not claim that new UFO footage supported his story. He did not reinterpret modern sightings through the lens of his experience. Instead, he maintained that his involvement ended decades earlier and that he had no further information beyond what he had already shared. By this stage, Lazar's story had become part of a larger discussion about how claims are evaluated over time. The focus shifted from immediate verification to long-term reliability. What remained clear was that his account had reached a stable state. It was no longer expanding or evolving. It existed as a fixed narrative that could be examined, criticized, or supported, but not easily dismissed as a momentary fabrication. As the debate continued, attention began to turn toward how Lazar's story fit within the broader culture of secrecy surrounding advanced research. Questions arose about whether systems designed to protect national security could also obscure accountability. And with those questions, the conversation moved beyond Bob Lazar as an individual and toward the structures that made his claims both difficult to prove and difficult to disprove. That broader context would shape how his story was interpreted in the years that followed. As Bob Lazar's story settled into public memory, the focus gradually shifted toward how it fit within a larger pattern of secrecy surrounding advanced research programs in the United States. By the early 1990s, the discussion was no longer centered only on Lazar as an individual, but on whether the system he described could realistically exist. Lazar consistently stated that the compartmentalization he experienced was not unusual. In classified programs, he explained, workers are intentionally given limited information. This approach reduces the risk of information leaks and ensures that no single person can describe an entire project. He pointed to historical examples that had once been secret and later acknowledged. Programs such as stealth aircraft development had been hidden for years before being revealed to the public. Lazar argued that secrecy itself could not be used as evidence that a claim was false. At the same time, skeptics emphasized that extraordinary claims required evidence. While secrecy could explain the lack of confirmation, it could not replace physical proof. This difference in standards became one of the central divisions in how Lazar's account was judged. As government discussions around unidentified aerial phenomena slowly became more open, Lazar's name resurfaced periodically. Each time, the same elements were reviewed. His description of S4, the number of craft, the propulsion system, element 115, the absence of documents. Despite renewed attention, Lazar did not alter his story to align with new developments. He did not connect modern sightings directly to the craft he described. He did not claim ongoing involvement or insider knowledge beyond his original experience. This restraint became notable. Many figures associated with controversial claims often expand their narratives over time. Lazar did not. His account remained confined to a specific period and location. During interviews, Lazar repeatedly emphasized that he did not seek validation through belief. He stated that people were free to accept or reject his account. His goal, he said, was to place the information on record. He also stated that he did not view himself as a representative of disclosure movements. He did not organize campaigns or participate in coordinated efforts to pressure the government. His involvement remained limited to responding when asked. This approach affected how his story was received. Some viewed his distance from advocacy as a sign of sincerity. Others argued that it avoided accountability. As years passed, new generations encountered Lazar's story through documentaries and long-form interviews. These presentations often contrasted his calm delivery with the dramatic nature of the claims. leaving audiences to draw their own conclusions. Investigative journalists revisiting the case found that while some aspects of Lazar's background were disputed, others remained unresolved rather than disproven. The Los Alamos connection persisted. The S-4 facility remained unacknowledged. No definitive evidence emerged to close the case. Lazar continued to state that he expected no confirmation during his lifetime. He argued that disclosure, if it occurred, would be driven by political or strategic factors rather than individual testimony. He also acknowledged that skepticism was reasonable. He did not frame disbelief as ignorance. Instead, he described it as a natural response to claims lacking evidence. This position placed Lazar's story in an unusual category. It was neither a fully supported account nor a conclusively debunked one. It existed in a space defined by documentation gaps and institutional silence. As discussion continued, analysts began to treat the Lazar case as a reference point, not as proof of extraterrestrial technology, but as an example of how secrecy complicates verification. The story no longer depended on new information. It depended on interpretation. Whether one viewed the lack of evidence as disqualifying or as a consequence of classification became the deciding factor. At this stage, the Bob Lazar case had moved beyond personal credibility. It had become a case study in how modern societies evaluate claims made from behind closed doors. And as that evaluation continued, the conversation naturally shifted again, away from Lazar's intentions and toward the broader implications of secrecy itself, including how much information could remain hidden and for how long. That shift marked another turning point in how the story would continue to be discussed. As public discussion around Bob Lazar continued, a new layer of examination focused on how his claims compared with what was known about classified government operations and information control. Analysts and journalists began studying not only what Lazar said, but how institutions typically respond when sensitive information is disclosed. Historically, when false claims about classified programs are made, government agencies often issue direct denials or corrections. In Lazar's case, no such response occurred. There was no statement confirming his account, but there was also no detailed rebuttal addressing the specifics of his claims. This absence became part of the discussion. Supporters argued that silence was consistent with classification protocols. Skeptics argued that silence alone could not be interpreted as validation. Lazar himself addressed this point repeatedly. He stated that the lack of response did not prove his claims, but it also did not disprove them. According to him, classified programs operate outside public accountability, and silence is often the default response. During this period, independent researchers attempted to verify physical aspects of Lazar's story. Some examined satellite imagery of the Papoose Lake area. Others reviewed flight patterns and restricted airspace data from the late 1980s. These efforts produced mixed results. Restricted zones and unusual flight routes were confirmed, but none could be directly linked to an S-4 facility as Lazar described it. The data showed heavy classification, but not definitive evidence. At the same time, interest in Area 51 itself increased. In 1994, the U.S. government officially acknowledged Area 51's existence for the first time, though without detail. This acknowledgement came years after Lazar had already discussed the base publicly. For some, this confirmation reinforced the idea that secrecy around Nevada facilities was deeper than previously admitted. For others, It demonstrated that secrecy did not automatically imply extraterrestrial technology. Lazar did not claim that the acknowledgement validated his account. He stated only that it showed how long information could remain officially unrecognized despite widespread awareness. Another point of focus during this phase was Lazar's technical explanations. Scientists and engineers reviewed his descriptions of gravity-based propulsion. While many rejected the feasibility of such systems, some acknowledged that the concepts did not directly contradict theoretical physics, even if they lacked experimental support. Lazar did not present himself as a theorist. He did not propose equations or models. He described systems as they were explained to him during briefings. He emphasized that he was reporting, not inventing. Critics argued that this reliance on briefings weakened his account. Supporters argued that it aligned with how compartmentalized programs operate, where specialists are informed only enough to perform their task. As media coverage continued, Lazar became more selective in his appearances. He stated that repeated interviews did not advance understanding and often reduced complex topics to simplified debate. Despite this, long-form interviews allowed him to explain his account without interruption. In these settings, his consistency remained evident. He did not contradict earlier statements or introduce new elements. Over time, Lazar's story became a reference point in discussions about whistleblowers and classified knowledge. Comparisons were made with individuals who later revealed confirmed programs, such as surveillance initiatives that were once denied and later acknowledged. These comparisons did not prove Lazar's claims, but they altered how some audiences perceived the possibility of long-term secrecy. As the years progressed, Lazar's involvement in the discussion continued to decrease. He did not attempt to reinsert himself into emerging UFO narratives. He did not claim knowledge of new developments or insider access. His account remained fixed in time. It referred to a specific period, a specific location, and a specific assignment. This stability became one of its defining features. The story neither expanded nor resolved. It existed unchanged, available for scrutiny, but resistant to closure. At this point, the Bob Lazar case had reached a mature phase. It was no longer driven by new claims or revelations. It was sustained by unresolved questions and institutional silence. And as attention continued, the focus began shifting again toward how Lazar's story influenced public perception of secrecy, technology, and the limits of verification. That influence would shape how similar claims were received in the years that followed, regardless of whether Lazar himself remained involved. As Bob Lazar's story continued to circulate over the years, attention increasingly turned toward the question of evidence. Not whether evidence existed in theory, but what kind of evidence could realistically emerge from a program designed to leave no trace. Lazar repeatedly stated that the absence of physical proof was not accidental. According to him, the structure of the program ensured that no individual could leave with documentation, materials, or verifiable artifacts. Everything related to the work was controlled, monitored, and retained within the facility. He explained that access to documents was strictly limited. Briefing materials were reviewed in secure rooms and were never allowed to leave those spaces. Notes were not permitted. Memory was the only thing an individual could carry out. This structure, Lazar claimed, was intentional. It allowed the program to continue even if personnel changed. Knowledge was distributed in fragments, preventing any single person from reconstructing the full project. Critics argued that such a system would be impractical over long periods. Large programs, they noted, inevitably generate paperwork, procurement records, and logistical trails. Lazar responded by stating that many classified programs operate through subcontractors and compartmentalized funding channels that obscure direct connections. During this phase of discussion, journalists revisited Lazar's employment history in greater detail. The Los Alamos National Laboratory connection continued to be examined. While his presence at the facility was confirmed through directories and witness statements, his job title remained disputed. Some former colleagues described him as technically capable, but did not recall him as a physicist. Lazar maintained that titles within classified environments were often misleading and that job descriptions did not always reflect actual responsibilities. This ambiguity became another defining feature of the case. It did not clearly support or refute his claims. It added complexity without resolution. At the same time, Lazar's personal life and business activities came under renewed scrutiny. Federal raids on his businesses were revisited in media coverage. Lazar stated that these actions were connected to his past disclosures. Authorities stated that the raids were related to unrelated investigations. No direct evidence was presented linking the raids to Lazar's claims about Area 51 or S4. As with many aspects of the case, interpretation depended on perspective. Throughout this period, Lazar maintained a consistent position. He did not present new allegations. He did not escalate his claims. He continued to describe the same experience, using the same language and scope as he had decades earlier. This restraint contrasted with the growing public interest in UFOs and government secrecy. As discussions about unidentified aerial phenomena entered mainstream political and scientific discourse, Lazar's story was often referenced as a precursor. However, Lazar himself did not attempt to connect his claims to new disclosures. He did not assert that modern UAP sightings were related to the craft he described. He avoided drawing lines between his experience and contemporary events. Instead, he emphasized that his involvement was limited to a specific time and assignment. He stated that he had no knowledge of what happened to the program after his departure. This limitation became important. It prevented his story from expanding into speculation. It also meant that his claims could not evolve alongside new information. For many observers, this raised a critical question. If Lazar was fabricating the story, why did it remain static? Why did it not adapt to new narratives or capitalize on emerging interest? Skeptics answered this by suggesting that maintaining a fixed story was part of the fabrication. Supporters countered that consistency under pressure suggested authenticity. Neither position resolved the issue. As analysts revisited the case, it became clear that the lack of evidence was not the only obstacle to resolution. The structure of secrecy itself prevented closure. Without access to classified records, there was no mechanism for independent verification. Lazar acknowledged this reality. He stated that his story would likely never be proven or disproven conclusively. He did not express frustration at this outcome. He described it as an expected result of the system he had encountered. By this stage, the Bob Lazar case had fully transitioned into a long-term unresolved account. It was no longer driven by new interviews or revelations. It existed as a reference point, not proof of alien technology, not evidence of deception, but a detailed account that remained suspended between confirmation and denial. And as that suspension continued, attention began shifting toward how stories like Lazar's influence public understanding of secrecy, trust, and institutional power, issues that extended far beyond one individual or one facility. That shift would frame how the case was discussed going forward. As Bob Lazar's account remained unresolved, researchers and journalists began comparing his story to other cases involving classified work and later disclosures. The goal was not to validate his claims directly, but to understand whether the structure he described matched known patterns of secrecy. Historically, many classified programs were denied or dismissed for years before being acknowledged. Examples included surveillance initiatives, experimental aircraft, and covert research facilities. In several cases, individuals who spoke early were ignored or discredited, only to be partially validated later when documents were released. This historical context became relevant when analyzing Lazar's situation. Supporters argued that early dismissal did not necessarily mean fabrication. Skeptics responded that comparison alone did not constitute evidence. Lazar did not actively participate in these comparisons. He did not align himself with other whistleblowers or claim to be part of a broader movement. He continued to state that his involvement was limited to one project and one period. During this phase, attention returned briefly to the S4 location. Independent researchers attempted to identify physical anomalies in the Papoose Lake area using satellite imagery and terrain analysis. Some claimed to see unusual grading patterns or structures consistent with buried facilities. However, none of these observations could be conclusively tied to Lazar's descriptions. Natural geological formations and military infrastructure produced similar visual signatures. No definitive proof emerged. Lazar acknowledged these efforts, but did not endorse any conclusions. He stated that from his experience, S4 was designed to avoid surface detection and that expecting visible evidence decades later was unrealistic. Another point of examination was Lazar's technical language. Engineers noted that while some terminology he used was imprecise, it did not resemble common science fiction tropes. His explanations lacked dramatic flair and avoided speculative detail. This neutrality became a recurring observation. Lazar did not embellish. He did not describe alien beings in detail. He did not discuss intentions or motives. His account remained focused on engineering problems and limitations. Critics argued that this restraint could be intentional. Supporters argued that it reflected a technical mindset. As public interest in UFOs increased, Lazar's story was often revisited in documentaries and long-form interviews. These presentations typically placed his account alongside counterarguments, allowing viewers to evaluate both sides. In these settings, Lazar maintained the same narrative structure. He corrected minor errors in dates or terminology, but did not revise core claims. He continued to state that the craft were not human-made, and that the technology could not be replicated. The absence of escalation remained notable. Lazar did not claim new discoveries or additional facilities. He did not expand the number of craft or introduce new locations. At the same time, government discussion around unidentified aerial phenomena began to change. Official reports acknowledged unexplained observations without assigning origin. This shift caused some viewers to reassess earlier claims, including Lazar's. However, Lazar did not interpret these developments as validation. He stated that modern UAP discussions involved unknowns and did not confirm past programs. This separation kept his account anchored in its original context. It neither benefited from nor contradicted newer disclosures. As analysis continued, the Lazar case became less about belief and more about methodology. How should claims be evaluated when evidence is inaccessible? What weight should consistency carry? How does institutional silence affect public judgment? These questions did not produce answers, but they framed the discussion more clearly. By this stage, Lazar's story had become a fixed reference point. It was no longer advancing toward resolution. It was being used to explore the limits of verification in systems designed to obscure information. The focus had shifted away from Lazar himself and toward the mechanisms that allowed such a story to persist without closure. And as that focus widened, the case moved closer to its final phase, where the absence of answers became the defining feature, rather than any single claim or contradiction. As the Bob Lazar case moved further into long-term analysis, attention increasingly focused on how his story influenced public understanding of secrecy rather than on whether it could be proven true or false. Over time, the lack of resolution itself became a defining feature. Lazar's account did not generate new evidence, but it also did not disappear. It remained present in discussions about classified research, often resurfacing when questions about government transparency were raised. This persistence was unusual for a story that lacked physical proof. One reason for this persistence was timing. Lazar came forward at a moment when Area 51 had not yet been officially acknowledged. At that time, even mentioning the base publicly was considered speculative. Years later, when the government confirmed the base's existence, it demonstrated that long-standing secrecy could be real. This acknowledgement did not validate Lazar's claims about alien technology, but it altered the context in which his story was judged. It showed that absence of confirmation did not necessarily mean absence of activity. Lazar did not claim credit for this shift. He did not argue that acknowledgement of Area 51 supported his story. He simply noted that secrecy could endure for decades without public admission. Another factor that sustained interest was the technical nature of his account. Lazar did not frame his experience as a revelation about extraterrestrial contact. He framed it as a failed reverse engineering effort. This distinction mattered. Rather than presenting aliens as active participants, Lazar described a passive object of study. The focus was on engineering limitations and lack of progress. This framing avoided speculation about intent or interaction. Because of this, his story was often discussed in technical terms rather than mythological ones. Analysts debated feasibility rather than belief. The discussion centered on whether such a program could exist, not what it meant. As public awareness of classified programs increased, comparisons were drawn to previously denied initiatives. Surveillance programs, weapons testing, and experimental aircraft were cited as examples where early whistleblowers were dismissed before later confirmation. Again, these comparisons did not validate Lazar's claims. They only demonstrated that dismissal alone was not proof of fabrication. Lazar remained largely absent from these discussions. He did not position himself as a commentator on secrecy. He did not offer opinions on broader policy issues. His statements remained limited to his own experience. This absence reinforced the static nature of his account. He did not evolve with the discussion. The discussion evolved around him. At the same time, skepticism remained strong. Critics continued to emphasize the lack of academic records and physical evidence. They argued that consistency without proof was insufficient. Supporters acknowledged these limitations but pointed to unresolved aspects of his background, such as the Los Alamos connection and unexplained employment gaps. Neither side produced decisive conclusions. As years passed, Lazar's story became a reference rather than a headline. It was cited in documentaries and articles as an example of unresolved claims within classified environments. The case was no longer actively investigated by mainstream media. It was revisited periodically, often without new information. This transition marked a shift in how the story functioned. It was no longer expected to be resolved. It was expected to persist. In this phase, the Bob Lazar story served a specific role. It illustrated how secrecy can prevent closure. It demonstrated how claims can remain suspended indefinitely when verification mechanisms are inaccessible. Lazar himself acknowledged this outcome. He stated that he did not expect confirmation or denial in his lifetime. He described the situation as a natural consequence of classification. He did not express regret about coming forward. He also did not express satisfaction. His position remained neutral. By this point, the case had reached a stable condition. It was neither advancing nor collapsing. It existed as a fixed account surrounded by debate. And as that condition settled, attention began shifting toward the final question surrounding the Lazar case. Not whether the story was true, but what it revealed about how modern societies handle information that cannot be tested. That question would frame the final stage of the discussion, where the absence of resolution became the conclusion itself. As the Bob Lazar case entered its later phase, the focus shifted away from attempts to verify specific claims and toward understanding why the story continued to hold public attention. By this point, the narrative had been examined from multiple angles, and no new evidence had emerged to change its status. What remained was a stable account that resisted both confirmation and dismissal. Lazar's story endured largely because it did not depend on new revelations. It existed as a complete account from the moment it was made public. There were no cliffhangers, no promised disclosures, and no future dates offered for validation. This removed the pressure of expectation and allowed the story to exist on its own terms. Another reason the case persisted was its limited scope. Lazar did not claim to represent a broader program or movement. He did not suggest that similar facilities existed worldwide or that contact with extraterrestrial beings was ongoing. His account was confined to a single location, a single assignment, and a defined period. This narrow focus reduced the number of contradictions that could arise over time. Without expansion, there was little opportunity for internal inconsistency. At the same time, the story remained controversial because it challenged assumptions about transparency. Lazar did not accuse the government of deception directly. He described a system where secrecy was standard procedure, not an exception. In this system, withholding information was not presented as wrongdoing, but as protocol. This framing made the story difficult to evaluate morally. It did not position Lazar as a hero or the government as an antagonist. It presented both as participants in a system designed to prioritize containment over disclosure. Lazar also did not seek legal action or formal acknowledgement. He did not attempt to force the release of documents or demand confirmation. His lack of pursuit reduced confrontation but also limited resolution. As public interest in unidentified aerial phenomena increased in later years, Lazar's story was often referenced as background context. New discussions about unexplained sightings led audiences to revisit older cases. However, Lazar consistently declined to connect his experience to modern events. He stated that he had no knowledge of ongoing programs or current technology. This prevented his story from becoming part of evolving narratives. This restraint preserved the integrity of the original account. It remained fixed and self-contained. For critics, this did not change the core issue. Without evidence, the story remained unproven. For supporters, The lack of contradiction over time continued to suggest authenticity. Neither position gained decisive ground. At this stage, the Bob Lazar case functioned less as a claim about extraterrestrial technology and more as a demonstration of how information can exist without resolution. It showed how a detailed account could persist indefinitely in the absence of verification mechanisms. Lazar acknowledged this reality. In later interviews, he stated that he understood why people doubted him. He did not express frustration at skepticism. He described it as a reasonable response to extraordinary claims. This acknowledgement further softened the debate. It removed the urgency to persuade and replaced it with acceptance of uncertainty. By now, Lazar's role in the discussion was minimal. He did not actively promote his story. He did not participate in campaigns or advocacy efforts. His involvement was passive. The story continued without him. As time passed, the Bob Lazar case became less about individual credibility and more about structural limitations. It highlighted how systems built to protect information can also prevent closure. This shift reframed the discussion. Instead of asking whether Lazar was telling the truth, analysts began asking whether truth was even accessible in such environments. That question did not require an answer to remain relevant. It applied to many classified programs beyond this case. As this realization settled, the Bob Lazar story approached its final stage. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer needed resolution to exist. It had become a permanent reference point, unchanged, unresolved, and continuously debated. And as the discussion reached this stage, the final question remained. Not about technology, but about certainty itself. As the Bob Lazar case settled into long-term discussion, it began to be treated less as a single claim and more as a reference point for evaluating secrecy itself. Analysts, journalists, and researchers stopped asking whether the story would be resolved and instead examined what its persistence revealed. One of the most notable aspects was how the case resisted closure without escalating. There were no new claims added over time. No additional facilities were introduced. No new witnesses were brought forward by Lazar himself. The story remained exactly as it had been presented decades earlier. This stability allowed the case to be examined repeatedly without shifting ground. Each review returned to the same elements. 4, the craft, the propulsion system, element 115, the lack of records, and the absence of official response. In many unresolved cases, contradictions eventually surface. Details change. Timelines shift. Motivations evolve. In Lazar's case, the absence of these changes became part of the analysis. Whether interpreted as consistency or rehearsal, it remained measurable. During this period, broader conversations about classified research continued to evolve. Government acknowledgement of secret programs increased in unrelated areas, including surveillance, cyber operations, and advanced aerospace testing. Each acknowledgement reinforced the idea that large-scale secrecy could exist for extended periods. These developments did not validate Lazar's claims directly, but they altered the environment in which they were judged. Skepticism remained, but absolute dismissal became harder to maintain without addressing structural secrecy. Lazar did not use these developments to support his story. He did not cite new disclosures as confirmation. He maintained separation between his experience and later events. This separation preserved the boundaries of the account. It prevented reinterpretation and avoided opportunistic alignment with new narratives. Another element that shaped discussion was Lazar's absence from institutional conflict. He did not pursue legal recognition. He did not challenge agencies publicly. He did not demand documentation. This absence was interpreted in different ways. Some viewed it as acceptance of limitations. Others saw it as avoidance of scrutiny. What remained consistent was that the story was not driven by confrontation. As time passed, the Bob Lazar case was increasingly referenced in academic and journalistic discussions about epistemology, the study of how knowledge is verified. It became an example of how claims can exist in environments where evidence is inaccessible by design. In such environments, traditional standards of proof fail. Documents are classified. Physical access is restricted. Witnesses are bound by secrecy. Verification mechanisms collapse. This did not mean claims were true. It meant they could not be tested. Lazar acknowledged this limitation explicitly. He stated that his story would likely never be proven. He did not argue that it should be believed. He argued only that it should be understood as a report from within a closed system. This framing shifted the discussion again. The question was no longer whether Lazar was correct, but whether certainty was achievable at all in such cases. This reframing did not end debate. It stabilized it. By this stage, the Bob Lazar case had become a fixed narrative within a broader conversation. It was not moving toward resolution. It was serving as a reference. New information did not change it. Criticism did not dismantle it. Support did not elevate it. The story existed unchanged, functioning as an example of how modern secrecy intersects with public knowledge. As this role became clear, the discussion entered its final phase. Not because the story ended, but because its purpose had shifted. The Bob Lazar case was no longer expected to answer questions. It was expected to raise them. And as that expectation replaced resolution, the story moved closer to its conclusion, not in terms of proof, but in terms of meaning. What remained was not a verdict, but a condition, a state in which information exists without confirmation, and where uncertainty is not temporary, but permanent. That condition would define the final stage of the Bob Lazar story. By this point, the Bob Lazar case had reached a stage where no new information was expected. The discussion no longer centered on discovery or exposure, but on endurance. The story had lasted not because it was proven, but because it remained intact under pressure. What distinguished Lazar's account from many other controversial claims was its resistance to collapse. Investigations into his background raised questions, but they did not erase every supporting detail. At the same time, supporters were unable to produce decisive evidence that would force confirmation. The case remained suspended between these two limits. This balance created a unique condition. Normally, unresolved stories fade as attention moves elsewhere. In Lazar's case, attention returned repeatedly, even when nothing new was added. The same elements were examined again and again, producing the same unresolved outcome. Lazar himself was no longer driving the narrative. He did not promote his story. He did not attempt to reframe it. He did not expand it to fit new conversations. The story existed independently of him. This separation mattered. It allowed the account to be evaluated without constant reinforcement. The narrative was not sustained through repetition or escalation. It persisted because it could not be fully dismissed. Another reason the case endured was its specificity. Lazar did not speak in general terms about secret technology. He described a location, a number of craft, a propulsion concept, and a defined period. These details could be questioned, but they could not be ignored. At the same time, the lack of physical evidence continued to limit interpretation. No materials were recovered. No documents surfaced. No additional witnesses from inside the facility came forward publicly. This absence created a ceiling. The story could not advance beyond where it began. Critics pointed to this ceiling as proof of fabrication. Supporters pointed to it as proof of secrecy. Neither argument resolved the issue. As years passed, new information about unidentified aerial phenomena entered public discussion. Government agencies acknowledged encounters without explanation. These acknowledgments changed how audiences perceived the possibility of unknown technology. However, these developments did not intersect directly with Lazar's claims. They did not reference S4, reverse-engineered craft, or Element 115. They existed in parallel. Lazar did not claim alignment with these events. He did not interpret them as validation. He maintained that his experience was limited and historical. This restraint preserved the original scope of the story. It prevented reinterpretation or expansion. By now, the Bob Lazar case had become a benchmark. It was cited not as evidence, but as context. It represented a category of claims that could not be verified due to structural limitations. Researchers studying secrecy and disclosure used the case to illustrate how information control affects public understanding. When access is restricted, belief and skepticism replace verification. Lazar acknowledged this outcome. He stated that he understood why people doubted him. He did not demand belief. He did not attempt persuasion. This position removed urgency from the debate. Without a push toward acceptance, the discussion stabilized. At this stage, the Bob Lazar story no longer generated new questions about what happened at S4. It generated questions about how societies process claims that cannot be tested. Those questions applied beyond this case. They applied to intelligence, defense, and classified research more broadly. The Lazar case became an example rather than a mystery. It illustrated the limits of public knowledge when systems are designed to remain closed. And as that role became clear, the story moved naturally toward its final point. Not a conclusion, but a condition. The condition in which a claim exists without resolution, sustained by consistency and constrained by secrecy. That condition would define how the Bob Lazar story was remembered. Today, the Bob Lazar story exists in a fixed state. Nothing new has been added, and nothing essential has been removed. The claims remain exactly as they were first presented in 1989. Bob Lazar stated that he worked at a facility known as S4, south of Area 51. He described studying non-human technology powered by a system that did not align with conventional physics. He explained the role of Element 115, the structure of the craft, and the limits of his access. He spoke publicly, accepted scrutiny, and did not revise his account. What followed was decades of examination without resolution. No government agency confirmed his claims. No official report addressed them in detail. At the same time, no formal statement was issued that directly disproved the specific elements he described. The result was not validation or rejection, but silence. That silence became permanent. Over time, Area 51 itself was acknowledged as a real location, confirming that secrecy on that scale was possible. Other classified programs were revealed years after public denial, reinforcing the idea that absence of confirmation does not necessarily indicate absence of activity. However, none of these developments confirmed Lazar's claims. They only demonstrated the environment in which such claims could exist without verification. The lack of evidence remained unchanged. No documents surfaced. No materials were produced. No additional insiders came forward publicly to support or contradict his account. This absence defined the case. From an analytical perspective, the Bob Lazar story occupies a narrow space. It cannot be treated as established fact. It also cannot be dismissed as a simple fabrication without addressing unresolved elements such as partial employment verification, consistent testimony, and institutional silence. The story does not evolve. It does not adapt to new narratives. It does not expand to include new claims or new locations. It remains anchored to a specific time, place, and experience. This anchoring is why the story continues to be referenced, not because it offers proof of extraterrestrial technology, but because it demonstrates how information can exist without resolution when systems are designed to prevent verification. Bob Lazar did not claim certainty. He did not demand belief. He stated what he said he observed and accepted that others might reject it. In doing so, he removed urgency from the narrative. The story does not push toward a conclusion. It remains open by design. For some, this openness is evidence of authenticity. For others, it is evidence of uncertainty. Neither interpretation closes the case. The Bob Lazar account stands as a record of one individual's experience within a closed system. It highlights the limits of public knowledge when access is restricted and documentation is controlled. It also highlights a broader reality. In environments governed by secrecy, truth does not always move toward confirmation or denial. Sometimes it remains suspended. That suspension is not temporary. It becomes permanent. And that is where the Bob Lazar story rests today. Not proven, not disproven, not resolved. Simply recorded, examined, and left open. This is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is a condition. A condition where information exists, questions remain, and certainty is not accessible. And within that condition, the story continues, not forward, not backward, but exactly where it has always been.